There is something strange I keep noticing about intelligent people. It doesn't appear immediately. Sometimes it takes years before the pattern becomes obvious, but once you start seeing it, it shows up everywhere. The more intelligent someone is, the harder it often becomes for them to move. Not always. Intelligence can lead to incredible things, but in many lives it creates a quiet paradox. The very ability that helps someone understand the world can slowly make action more complicated. From the outside, this looks confusing. An intelligent person understands things. They read constantly. They think carefully. They analyze systems, motives, consequences. Often they can explain their own situation with uncomfortable precision. They know why certain things in their life don't work. They know the patterns, the background, the psychological reasons, the structural problems. Sometimes they can explain everything so clearly that you start believing a change must be right around the corner. And yet, nothing moves. Years pass. The same explanations remain. I keep seeing the same kind of conversation. Someone sits with a cup of coffee late in the evening, maybe scrolling through another article about psychology or decision-making. They can talk for hours about how systems shape people, how childhood patterns repeat themselves, how social expectations quietly guide our choices. The analysis is impressive, thoughtful, structured. But after a while, something becomes obvious. All that understanding is not bringing them any closer to a different life. Sometimes it even seems to make movement harder, because intelligence gives a very powerful tool: explanation. An explanation can quietly become one of the most comfortable ways to stay exactly where you are. When you can logically explain why now isn't the right moment, why conditions are not ideal yet, why a certain risk doesn't make sense, the internal pressure disappears. Everything inside the mind feels organized. The situation looks mapped out and understood. For a moment, it almost feels like progress. But outside the mind, nothing has changed. Intelligence can become a very elegant way to stay stuck. An intelligent person rarely acts impulsively. They are used to testing ideas before trusting them. They question assumptions. They search for patterns and try to understand the full structure of a situation. These are incredible skills. In learning, in research, in solving complex problems. But life is not always a system that can be solved before you enter it. At certain moments, movement has to come before full understanding. And that is exactly where intelligence begins to struggle. Because uncertainty makes the mind uncomfortable. The mind wants clarity, a map, a forecast, something that can be calculated before the first step is taken. When that clarity is missing, a subtle defense mechanism appears. It doesn't shout. It doesn't forbid action. It simply whispers something that sounds very reasonable. Let's think about this a little longer. And the smarter the person is, the more convincing that voice becomes. They can find studies. They can quote examples. They can analyze why certain attempts failed for other people. They can explain in detail how a wrong move might unfold. Every argument sounds thoughtful, careful, responsible. From the outside, it looks like maturity. But time moves differently inside that process. Weeks pass, then months, then sometimes years. Eventually, it becomes clear that behind all this thinking, there has been one repeating action: postponement. Not because the person is lazy, not because they are unwilling to change, because the mind has become extremely good at justifying delay. Meanwhile, something else happens quietly. Understanding begins to replace movement. A person starts telling themselves something that is technically true. I understand what is happening. And that statement might be completely accurate. But understanding does not automatically open the door out of the situation. Sometimes it becomes its substitute. You see this especially clearly in people who read a lot about psychology or self-development. They know the language of awareness. They can talk about inner scripts, cognitive biases, childhood patterns, unconscious fears. They can explain everything. And after listening to them for a while, you start realizing something strange. They already understand their situation extremely well, yet their life hasn't moved. Understanding can feel like movement, but those two things are not the same. One happens inside the mind, the other happens in the world. And sometimes, intelligence quietly convinces a person that the first one is enough. This creates a strange comfort zone. Not a comfortable life, exactly. Many intelligent people remain deeply dissatisfied with their situation. They feel restless. Something inside them knows that things could be different. But at the same time, they can explain exactly why the change hasn't happened yet, why the timing is complicated, why the system is difficult, why the risk still doesn't make sense. Over time, those explanations start building something unexpected. A structure. A very logical structure. A structure made of reasons. And inside that structure, the person becomes extremely good at living patiently with a life they do not actually want. Not because they lack intelligence, because their intelligence has learned how to make waiting look reasonable. At some point, an uncomfortable thought begins to appear, usually quietly, usually late at night or during some moment when the usual explanations stop feeling convincing. A thought that intelligent people rarely enjoy looking at directly. What if my intelligence isn't helping me move forward? What if it is doing something else entirely? What if it is helping me explain my situation so well that I no longer feel the urgency to leave it? That possibility is difficult to accept, because for many intelligent people, their identity is built around understanding. They are the person who sees patterns, who notices structures, who explains why things happen the way they do. And when that identity becomes strong enough, something subtle begins to happen. Understanding itself becomes a place to stay. Not a step in a journey, a destination. And once someone arrives there, the mind can spend years refining the explanation, adding details, improving the theory, perfecting the model. Meanwhile, the original question remains quietly waiting underneath everything. If I understand my situation this well, why am I still in it? The pattern becomes even clearer when a person slowly starts confusing understanding with movement. It doesn't happen suddenly. Usually, it begins very quietly. First, there is a feeling that you're already on some kind of path. You're reading more than before, listening to long conversations about psychology, behavior, motivation. You notice patterns in your own decisions. Certain things about your past finally start making sense. Old habits stop looking random. You begin connecting events that once seemed unrelated. From the inside, this feels like real progress. And to be fair, part of it actually is. Awareness does change a person. When you start noticing the invisible scripts that shaped your behavior for years, you are no longer completely unconscious inside them. But sometimes the change stays inside the mind. Outside, life looks almost exactly the same. A person can spend years speaking the language of self-awareness perfectly. They talk about patterns, systems, unconscious reactions, childhood conditioning. They can describe everything with almost clinical accuracy. Why they hesitate, why certain decisions feel difficult, why their life seems stuck in the same structure. And after listening long enough, a strange impression appears. It feels like the person already understands their situation completely, but nothing has moved. At that point, the intellect starts functioning in a way that resembles pain medication. It reduces anxiety. It explains discomfort. It transforms confusion into something organized and understandable. Understanding creates the sensation of control, and control feels good, very good. When a situation is explained, it becomes easier to tolerate. But there is a quiet danger hiding inside that comfort. Control without movement becomes stagnation. When everything makes sense intellectually, the inner pressure to act begins to fade. You no longer feel the urgency that pushes people into uncomfortable decisions. Life becomes easier to endure exactly as it is, because there is always another explanation available, another interpretation, another reason why the moment still isn't right. And then another trap appears. For intelligent people, it becomes surprisingly difficult to say a simple sentence, "I don't know what to do." For someone less analytical, that sentence is not a big problem. They might shrug and say, "I'm not sure. I'll try something." But for someone whose identity revolves around understanding, those words feel almost threatening. Not knowing challenges the image they have built of themselves, the image of the person who understands things, the person who sees deeper patterns than others, the one who can explain complicated situations clearly. Over time, that role becomes part of identity. You become the person who interprets reality for others. And then one day, you discover something uncomfortable. The next step in your own life cannot be fully explained in advance. It contains uncertainty, possibility of failure, possibility of making a decision that later turns out to be wrong. For intelligent people, mistakes often feel heavier than they objectively are. Not because mistakes destroy everything, because they damage the internal image of being someone who knows what they're doing. So instead of stepping forward, the person continues thinking. More analysis, more understanding, more preparation. From the outside, this looks respectable, even admirable. But sometimes it quietly becomes another version of avoidance. You can often hear it in a sentence people say with a small smile, "I'm still researching it," and that "still" can last years. They know every argument, every possible outcome, every risk, everything except one thing. They don't know what happens when analysis stops and reality begins. Because reality is rarely clean. It's messy, unpredictable, full of imperfect decisions made with incomplete information. And this is exactly the environment where pure intellect stops being enough. Outside the familiar mental structures, experience begins to matter more. Trying things, making mistakes, adjusting direction. Those are the things intelligent people often try hardest to minimize. And this is where the most uncomfortable realization slowly appears. If intelligence has become the main tool for avoiding risk, then it can no longer function as a tool for leaving the situation. It still works perfectly, but it has changed sides. Instead of supporting movement, it protects stillness. The mind can quietly become a prison made of perfect explanations. A person can sincerely believe they are in the process. They might say they are working on themselves, reflecting, understanding deeper layers of their behavior. And all of that might be true. But time keeps moving. Years pass, and eventually something becomes difficult to ignore. Life has been happening somewhere nearby the entire time. Not because the person lacked intelligence, sometimes because they had too much of it for steps that cannot be explained before they are taken. At that point, a question appears that the mind would prefer not to face directly. A question that intelligent people often postpone longer than anyone else. What if my intelligence helped me understand the trap, but never helped me leave it? That question doesn't demand an immediate solution. It's not about forcing action or making dramatic decisions. It is something simpler: honesty. Recognizing that understanding is not always the final destination. Sometimes it is preparation, and sometimes it becomes a very comfortable resting place. A place where a person can spend years feeling thoughtful, aware, and almost ready. Almost ready to begin. Without ever discovering what would have happened if they stepped beyond the explanation. And perhaps the most difficult idea for an intelligent mind to accept is this: the same intellect that helps a person understand the world can also become the most reliable way to keep their life exactly as it is. Understanding is not the same thing as moving. And once someone notices that difference clearly, the entire structure of explanations begins to feel a little less convincing. Not wrong, just incomplete. And sometimes that quiet realization is the first moment when the mind stops protecting the trap and begins slowly to look for a way out.